The only thing more dangerous than ignorance is confidence wearing a tailored suit. The sentence drifted across the private dining room so quietly that almost no one noticed who had whispered it, yet it landed at exactly the wrong moment. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of Manhattan's skyline as the city's wealthiest investors gathered around a polished walnut table on the top floor of one of the most exclusive restaurants overlooking Central Park. The evening had been carefully arranged for one purpose. Billionaire Richard Hawthorne was about to reveal the mathematical model behind his newest investment platform, a system his executives proudly described as the future of financial forecasting. Every guest listened with admiration as Richard sketched numbers across a digital display mounted beside the dining table. Years of success had given him a commanding presence. His calm voice carried the certainty of someone rarely questioned, and every confident explanation drew approving nods from venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and technology founders eager to invest another fortune into whatever idea carried his name. Several feet away, Naomi Carter quietly refilled water glasses without interrupting a single conversation. Dressed in a simple black server uniform with a neatly tied apron, she blended so naturally into the background that most guests never looked directly at her. To them, she was simply another waitress making certain dinner unfolded without interruption. Yet as Richard confidently explained one particularly complex optimization formula, Naomi paused for only a fraction of a second. Her eyes rested briefly on the glowing equations before a small, almost involuntary smile crossed her face. It was not a smile of disrespect. It was the quiet expression of someone recognizing a familiar mistake. Unfortunately, Richard looked up at exactly that moment. The room fell noticeably quieter as he lowered the digital pen and turned toward her. "Did I miss something amusing?" he asked, his voice carrying easily across the room. Every conversation stopped. Dozens of curious eyes shifted toward Naomi, who immediately placed the water pitcher gently onto the serving cart. "No, sir," she answered politely. "I was only thinking." Richard smiled, but warmth never reached his eyes. "Thinking about advanced quantitative modeling?" A few guests laughed softly. Naomi remained composed. "Something like that." The laughter grew louder. One executive leaned back in his chair with an amused grin, while another whispered something that caused several people around the table to smile even wider. Richard folded his arms and studied her for another long moment. "Tell me," he said, "how many calculus classes does this restaurant require before handing someone an apron?" More laughter echoed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not in embarrassment but in patience. She had heard different versions of the same assumption more times than she could count. People often believed uniforms revealed intelligence. She had long ago stopped trying to correct them. Richard glanced back toward his audience, clearly enjoying the moment. "You smiled," he continued. "That usually means one of two things. Either you understood what I just explained, or you think I made a mistake." The room waited. Naomi hesitated only long enough to choose her words carefully. "Everyone makes mistakes sometimes, sir." The answer was gentle, respectful, and completely sincere. Yet the silence that followed somehow felt louder than every laugh that had come before. Richard slowly turned back toward the digital display, then looked once more at the quiet waitress standing beside the serving cart. For the first time that evening, curiosity quietly replaced amusement in his eyes, because very few people had ever answered him that way without a trace of fear. Naomi Carter quietly picked up the water pitcher again as though nothing unusual had happened. The laughter faded behind her, while she continued moving from table to table with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through hundreds of evening shifts. She remembered every guest's preferred drink, every allergy, every reservation detail, without writing anything down. Her coworkers often joked that she could organize an entire dining room inside her head, but none of them knew that memorizing dinner orders was effortless compared to the pages of mathematical proofs she had once carried through university hallways. Long before she learned the names of expensive wines, she had learned how elegant equations could uncover hidden patterns that most people never noticed. Numbers had always spoken to her with a clarity the world rarely offered. As a little girl growing up in Newark, New Jersey, she had spent rainy afternoons solving puzzles borrowed from the local library instead of watching television. Her mother, an elementary school teacher, never measured intelligence by grades alone. She believed curiosity mattered far more than trophies. Every Saturday morning, they sat together at the small kitchen table with sharpened pencils, worn notebooks, and cups of hot chocolate, while difficult problems slowly transformed into exciting adventures. Those quiet mornings remain Naomi's favorite memories long after life became far more complicated. During college, she earned scholarship after scholarship, eventually entering one of the country's most respected graduate mathematics programs. Professors predicted a remarkable academic career. One even told her she possessed the rare ability to see relationships between formulas before anyone else recognized they existed. Then everything changed within a single year. Her mother's health began to decline unexpectedly. Medical appointments became weekly responsibilities, and Naomi's younger brother suddenly needed someone dependable at home. The research that had once filled her days was gradually replaced by hospital visits, grocery lists, late-night tutoring sessions to earn extra income, and every practical responsibility that could not simply be postponed. Leaving graduate school had never felt like giving up on mathematics. It felt like choosing family over recognition. She never regretted that decision, although she quietly missed the classroom every time she solved another problem in her head while clearing dinner plates. Even now, she still volunteered twice each week at a neighborhood community center, teaching mathematics to middle school students who believed they were not smart enough because someone else had convinced them of it. Naomi always began those lessons the same way. Your answer matters less than your willingness to keep thinking. Watching uncertain children slowly discover confidence brought her more satisfaction than any academic title ever could. Back inside the restaurant, she carried a tray toward the private dining room while the conversation about investment models continued behind the closed doors. Richard Hawthorne's guests remained fascinated by his presentation, yet Naomi found herself quietly replaying the equation she had seen on the digital display only minutes earlier. One assumption inside the optimization model refused to leave her thoughts. It was subtle enough that most people would never notice it, but once she saw it, she could not pretend it was not there. As she gently placed fresh coffee beside an empty seat near the conference table, her eyes briefly met the glowing screen again. The numbers were still beautiful. They were also still incomplete. Without realizing it, she reached for a folded cocktail napkin, picked up a pen from the service station, and calmly wrote 3 short lines of mathematics before quietly setting the napkin beside her serving tray, never imagining that someone at the table had been watching her every movement. Richard Hawthorne noticed the folded cocktail napkin before Naomi could slide it beneath the serving tray. His eyes had been trained by decades of studying balance sheets, contracts, and market trends that often revealed more in small details than bold headlines ever could. The neat rows of handwritten symbols immediately caught his attention because they were not random numbers. They were corrections. He reached across the polished walnut table, picked up the napkin between 2 fingers, and studied it without saying a word. The room gradually fell quiet again as several investors leaned forward, curious about what had interrupted the evening's presentation. Richard read the equations once, then a second time, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, he looked toward Naomi, who had already resumed arranging coffee cups as though the napkin no longer mattered. "Did you write this?" he asked. Naomi turned politely. "Yes, sir." Richard lifted the napkin slightly. "Do you understand what these equations represent?" "Yes, sir." "Then explain why you changed my optimization constraint." His voice remained calm, but the challenge beneath it was unmistakable. Every guest at the table turned toward Naomi. Crystal glasses stood untouched. Conversations disappeared beneath the soft music drifting through the restaurant. Naomi hesitated only briefly before answering. "Because the model assumes identical probability distributions across independent variables," she said evenly. "They are not identical. Once that assumption changes, the projected efficiency changes with it." A few executives exchanged puzzled looks. One quietly laughed under his breath, convinced she had memorized technical vocabulary without understanding its meaning. Richard rested the napkin beside his tablet and folded his hands. "That is a very confident observation." Naomi gently shook her head. "No, sir. It is simply an observation." Richard slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the large interactive display mounted beside the dining table. With a few quick movements, he reopened the mathematical model for everyone to see. Rows of equations illuminated the elegant dining room in cool blue light, contrasting sharply against the warm glow of the chandeliers overhead. He turned back toward his guests with a slight smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "it appears our waitress believes she has discovered an error inside a model developed by an entire research division." Laughter immediately spread around the room. One investor leaned back comfortably and whispered, "This should be entertaining." Another reached for his wine glass without taking his eyes off Naomi. Richard looked at her again, his confidence growing stronger with every amused smile surrounding him. He had built billion-dollar companies by trusting exceptional minds, and every one of those experts had reviewed the equations now glowing behind him. The idea that someone carrying dinner plates had identified a flaw they had all missed felt almost impossible. "Tell me," he said, crossing his arms, "where exactly did you study mathematics?" Naomi answered honestly, "I was in graduate school before leaving to care for my family." Richard nodded slowly. "So you never finished?" "No, sir." Several people quietly smiled, believing they already knew how the conversation would end. Richard glanced once more at the napkin before looking directly into Naomi's eyes. "Interesting," he said, "because unfinished education usually produces unfinished conclusions." The room responded with another wave of restrained laughter, but Naomi neither defended herself nor looked away. She simply stood beside the serving cart with calm composure, while beyond the restaurant windows the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the evening skyline. And somewhere deep inside Richard's curiosity, certainty began quietly preparing to challenge itself. Richard Hawthorne slowly placed the cocktail napkin on the center of the polished table and looked around the private dining room with the confident smile of a man who had spent his entire career turning impossible situations into opportunities. The investors watched him with growing anticipation, sensing that the evening had unexpectedly become more entertaining than the presentation itself. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan reflected across the dark glass like thousands of tiny equations waiting to be solved. Inside, every eye remained fixed on the quiet waitress standing beside her serving cart. Naomi Carter neither shifted her posture nor searched for an escape. She simply waited, her hands resting lightly against the silver tray as though she had all the time in the world. Richard finally broke the silence. "You know," he said, "people spend years trying to impress rooms like this." He gestured toward the executives surrounding the table. "You managed to do it by correcting a billionaire on a cocktail napkin." Soft laughter circled the room again. Richard continued, "So let us make tonight a little more interesting." He walked back to the interactive display and erased the previous equations with one smooth motion. The glowing screen became blank before a completely different mathematical optimization problem appeared. It was considerably more difficult than the one Naomi had quietly corrected only moments earlier. Multiple constraints stretched across the display alongside nonlinear variables and probability functions that caused several investors to shake their heads before even attempting to follow the logic. Richard turned toward the room with obvious satisfaction. "This problem challenged my quantitative research team for nearly 3 weeks," he explained. "Only 2 people produced complete solutions, and both hold doctorates in applied mathematics." His gaze settled on Naomi once more. "If you believe your observation was more than luck, then perhaps you would enjoy a real challenge." The room grew perfectly still. One executive smiled knowingly while another quietly checked his watch, convinced the evening was about to return to normal after one harmless distraction. Richard folded his arms. "Solve this correctly," he said calmly, "and I will personally write you a check for $1 million before dessert is served." A wave of surprised whispers moved around the table. Even experienced investors exchanged uncertain glances. The amount was insignificant to Richard, but the public challenge was anything but ordinary. Naomi looked briefly at the glowing equations before returning her attention to Richard. "Why would you do that?" she asked gently. Richard smiled. "Because extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary proof." Naomi remained silent for several seconds. The restaurant around them continued operating, but inside the private dining room time seemed to slow. The soft music faded into the background until even the quiet clink of silverware from distant tables became strangely noticeable. Finally, Naomi spoke. "If I solve it, I do not want the money." Several people looked at one another in confusion. Richard raised an eyebrow. Everyone wants $1 million. Naomi shook her head with quiet certainty. Not everyone wants the same thing. Richard leaned slightly forward, curiosity replacing amusement once again. Then what would you ask for? Naomi glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of people who had laughed only minutes earlier before answering in the same calm voice that had never once risen above conversation level. I would ask that the next person wearing an apron be judged after they speak instead of before. The room fell completely silent, and for the first time that evening, not a single person found anything funny. Naomi Carter looked at the glowing equations without stepping closer to the interactive display. She did not ask for additional time. She did not request reference books, a calculator, or even a sheet of paper. The confidence surrounding Richard Hawthorne's table seemed almost tangible, filling the elegant dining room like the fragrance of expensive coffee and polished cedar. Several investors relaxed comfortably in their chairs, convinced they were about to witness the inevitable moment when reality caught up with quiet ambition. Richard noticed that Naomi had not moved. You may use the display if you would like, he offered, gesturing toward the screen. Naomi smiled politely. Thank you, but I only need a marker. One of the restaurant managers quickly handed her a black, dry erase marker, uncertain whether to admire her courage or worry about the direction the evening had taken. Naomi accepted it with a quiet nod and slowly approached the illuminated board. Every footstep across the polished hardwood floor seemed louder than the one before. The room became so silent that the soft hum of the climate control system suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Standing before the enormous display, Naomi studied the equations for less than a minute. Her eyes moved naturally across every constraint and probability function, not searching frantically for an answer, but recognizing familiar mathematical relationships the way experienced musicians recognize melodies after hearing only a few notes. Richard watched carefully, expecting hesitation. Instead, Naomi uncapped the marker and wrote a single expression beneath the original model. Several guests frowned immediately because she had not attempted to solve the problem directly. She had rewritten one assumption instead. Richard crossed his arms. Interesting place to begin, he observed. Naomi nodded without turning around. Everything after this depends on whether the first assumption is true. Richard replied confidently, It is true. My research division verified it. Naomi calmly drew a thin line beneath the equation before continuing. They verified it under stable conditions. Richard answered almost instantly. The model is designed for stable conditions. Naomi wrote another expression. Markets rarely remain stable long enough for that assumption to survive. A few investors exchanged uncertain glances. One quietly opened his tablet and began following each step as she continued building the solution. Naomi never rushed. Every equation flowed naturally into the next, each transformation explained in clear, conversational language instead of academic jargon. Even guests without advanced mathematical backgrounds began understanding the logic because she translated complexity into simple ideas rather than impressive vocabulary. Richard interrupted several times, pointing toward individual variables and questioning specific transitions. Each time, Naomi paused respectfully before answering. She never challenged his intelligence. She simply explained why a different interpretation produced a more reliable result once uncertainty entered the system. The conversation gradually shifted. Richard was no longer testing whether Naomi understood the mathematics. He was testing whether he had overlooked something himself. Around the table, smiles slowly disappeared. Investors who had expected an entertaining spectacle now leaned forward with genuine concentration. One quietly erased his own handwritten notes and started over from the beginning. Another compared Naomi's reasoning against the original presentation, his eyebrows rising a little higher with every passing minute. Even the restaurant staff standing discreetly near the entrance sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. The elegant dining room, once filled with polite laughter and casual confidence, now held only the quiet rhythm of a marker gliding across glass and the steady voice of a waitress who spoke about mathematics with the calm certainty of someone describing a familiar path she had walked countless times before, while Richard stared at the growing solution and realized he had stopped looking at the apron long ago. Naomi Carter placed the marker gently on the narrow ledge beneath the interactive display and stepped back, without saying a word. The final equation glowed against the glass wall, surrounded by the chain of careful reasoning that had carried every person in the room from certainty into thoughtful silence. Nobody applauded. Nobody whispered. Even the servers waiting discreetly near the entrance remained perfectly still, holding polished silver trays that suddenly felt much lighter than the quiet filling the room. Outside the towering windows, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the evening skyline, while slow-moving traffic traced ribbons of white and red beneath the buildings. Inside, time seemed to pause. Richard Hawthorne stared at the completed solution without blinking. He reached toward the display almost instinctively, tracing one section of the equations with his finger before lowering his hand again. Then he quietly picked up the digital pen and began checking Naomi's work one line at a time. His movements lacked the confidence that had defined him only minutes earlier. They carried something much rarer: genuine uncertainty. Around the table, several investors opened laptops and tablets, entering the revised formulas exactly as Naomi had written them. Fingers moved across keyboards with remarkable speed, yet every passing second only deepened the silence instead of breaking it. One analyst quietly adjusted his glasses before recalculating the optimization under changing market conditions. Another compared the original assumptions with Naomi's revised structure. Their expressions gradually shifted from curiosity to concentration, then from concentration to quiet disbelief. No one interrupted the process because everyone understood that the mathematics would speak more honestly than any opinion ever could. Naomi remained beside the serving cart where she had started the evening. She neither watched the calculations nor searched anyone's face for approval. Instead, she carefully folded a clean linen napkin, straightened a misplaced dessert spoon, and refilled a water glass that had quietly emptied during the discussion. Her calmness stood in striking contrast to the tension surrounding the table. It was as though she had already accepted whatever conclusion the numbers would reveal. The soft piano music drifting through the restaurant blended with the gentle sound of ice settling inside crystal glasses. Somewhere beyond the dining room, a waiter thanked departing guests, and an elevator chimed quietly before disappearing into the background once more. Richard finally stopped writing. His eyes remained fixed on one particular line near the center of the display. He recalculated it again, then once more. Each time, the same answer appeared. He slowly leaned back and looked toward the city lights beyond the windows, saying nothing. Across the table, one investor quietly closed his laptop and exhaled almost imperceptibly. Another simply lowered his eyes, realizing that the elegant solution standing before them had exposed a flaw none of their highly paid specialists had noticed. The room no longer felt like the private dining space of a luxury restaurant. It felt like a classroom where certainty had quietly surrendered to truth. Richard turned back toward the display one final time before looking across the room at Naomi. The confidence that had once filled his expression had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful respect he had not expected to discover that evening. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Between the glowing equations, the untouched dessert plates, and the quiet skyline stretching beyond the glass, the answer had already begun changing far more than a mathematical model. Richard Hawthorne slowly walked toward the interactive display until he stood only a few feet away from the equations Naomi Carter had written. He studied every symbol one final time before turning to the senior quantitative analyst seated near the end of the table. "Run her model through the live market simulation," he said quietly. The analyst nodded immediately, connected his laptop to the large display, and began entering Naomi's revisions exactly as they appeared. Nobody spoke while the software processed millions of possible outcomes. The only sounds came from soft keyboard strokes and the distant murmur of the restaurant continuing beyond the closed dining room doors. Richard remained standing with his hands resting lightly against the back of a leather chair. The confidence that had once encouraged him to challenge a waitress before an audience had been replaced by genuine anticipation. Within moments, the first simulation finished. The projected efficiency improved significantly. The analyst frowned, reset the parameters, and launched another test using different market conditions. Once again, Naomi's revised model produced stronger and more stable results than the original version developed by Richard's research division. A third analyst quietly joined the verification, determined to find an error somewhere inside the calculations. Instead, he discovered something even more surprising. Naomi had not merely corrected an assumption. She had identified a structural weakness that quietly multiplied financial risk whenever market conditions became unpredictable. The flaw had remained hidden because every previous evaluation assumed ideal circumstances instead of realistic ones. One investor slowly removed his glasses and whispered, "That adjustment could prevent losses measured in hundreds of millions of dollars over the next decade." Another executive looked from the display toward Naomi with open disbelief. "How did nobody catch this?" he asked softly. Richard did not answer immediately because he was asking himself the same question. His eyes returned to the cocktail napkin still resting on the polished table. 3 simple lines of handwriting had led to a discovery that entire departments of highly educated professionals had overlooked. Finally, Richard looked directly at Naomi. "When did you notice it?" he asked. Naomi answered without hesitation. "The moment your presentation reached the probability assumptions." Richard blinked. "Less than a minute?" "Yes, sir." "Why were you so certain?" Naomi smiled gently. "Because mathematics does not care about job titles. It only cares whether the reasoning is true." Her words settled over the room with quiet force. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Several investors lowered their eyes, remembering how quickly they had dismissed her before she had spoken. Richard slowly walked to the table and picked up the $1 million checkbook that his assistant had placed beside his presentation materials earlier that evening. He opened it carefully, uncapped his pen, then stopped before writing anything. For the first time in many years, money no longer seemed like the most valuable thing he could offer. He closed the checkbook again and looked back at Naomi with a thoughtful expression that carried neither pride nor embarrassment, only respect earned through undeniable truth. Around them, the warm light reflected across crystal glasses and polished wood while the city shimmered beyond the windows, and every person in the room understood that the greatest surprise of the evening had never been the solution itself. It had been the quiet brilliance hidden behind an apron that almost everyone had judged before taking the time to listen. Richard Hawthorne remained silent for several long moments before slowly placing the closed checkbook on the polished table. Every person in the private dining room watched him, expecting the billionaire to complete the wager exactly as promised. Instead, he walked away from the head of the table and stopped in front of Naomi Carter. There was no audience left to impress. The confidence that had once filled his posture had softened into something far more genuine. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The words settled over the room with surprising weight because they came from a man whose reputation had always been built on certainty rather than admission. Richard continued without looking away. "When you smiled earlier tonight, I assumed you believed you were smarter than everyone in this room. I judged your uniform before I listened to your reasoning. That mistake belongs entirely to me." The executives around the table lowered their eyes. Several remembered their own laughter only a short time before and found themselves wishing they could take it back. Naomi stood calmly with the same composed expression she had carried throughout the evening. She did not appear triumphant. She did not seem interested in proving anyone wrong. She simply listened. Richard picked up the $1 million checkbook again and carefully wrote the promised amount before removing the check and extending it toward her. "A promise should remain a promise," he said. Naomi accepted the check respectfully, but did not look at the number written across the paper. Instead, she folded it once and held it gently between her hands. Richard noticed her hesitation. "You told me earlier that you did not want the money," he said. "Has your answer changed?" Naomi smiled warmly. "No, sir. My answer has not changed." She carefully placed the check back onto the table in front of Richard. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Nobody expected anyone to refuse a gift of $1 million. Richard looked genuinely confused. "Why?" he asked. Naomi answered in the same calm voice that had guided every equation she solved. "Because I already have enough to take care of my family. There are children in neighborhoods like the one where I grew up who believe mathematics belongs to someone else. They stop believing in themselves before they ever discover what they are capable of. If this money can change anything, let it change that." Richard stared at the check resting between them before looking back at Naomi. "You want me to fund your tutoring program?" Naomi gently shook her head. "Not my program. Their future." The distinction lingered in the air. One investor quietly removed a handkerchief and cleared his glasses, pretending to wipe away moisture gathering in his eyes. Another executive leaned back without speaking, reflecting on how differently the evening might have ended if nobody had given Naomi the opportunity to explain a single equation. Richard slowly picked up the check once more and tore it in half. Several people gasped softly before he reached for a fresh check and began writing again. This time, the amount contained several additional zeros. When he finished, he slid it across the table toward Naomi. "Then this is no longer a prize," he said. "It is the first investment in a scholarship foundation that will carry your name, and I would consider it an honor if you would help build it." Naomi looked at the new check, then at the people surrounding the table. The room that had welcomed her with laughter now waited quietly for her answer, united not by wealth or status, but by the simple realization that true greatness had entered wearing an apron instead of a tailored suit. Naomi Carter looked at the new check for a long moment before carefully folding it and placing it inside the small notebook she always carried in the pocket of her apron. She extended her hand toward Richard Hawthorne, not as someone accepting a victory, but as someone welcoming a new beginning. Richard shook her hand firmly, understanding that the most valuable agreement reached that evening had never been written on paper. It had been built on humility, trust, and the willingness to see another person without the weight of assumptions. Around the table, the investors slowly rose from their seats. One after another, they introduced themselves to Naomi with genuine respect. They no longer asked what restaurant she worked in. They asked about the students she taught, the tutoring sessions she organized after long workdays, and the dreams she hoped those children would one day achieve. Naomi answered every question with the same quiet warmth she had shown from the beginning. She spoke about children who solved equations on library tables because they did not have computers at home. She described students who believed they were not intelligent simply because nobody had ever encouraged them to keep trying after making mistakes. She explained that confidence was rarely born from praise alone. More often, it grew from having one person who refused to give up on you. Richard listened carefully, realizing that while he had spent decades investing in companies, Naomi had been investing in people all along. Several months later, the Scholarship Foundation officially opened its first community mathematics center in Newark, New Jersey, only a few blocks from the public library where Naomi had discovered her love for numbers as a child. Bright classrooms replaced empty offices. Shelves filled with books, laptops, and learning materials welcomed students every afternoon. The entrance displayed a simple message chosen by Naomi herself. Ability grows where opportunity is given. Richard attended the opening ceremony without cameras or reporters. He stood quietly near the back while families filled the room with hopeful conversations and children explored puzzles spread across the tables. Before the ribbon was cut, he noticed a familiar sight. Naomi had already gathered a small circle of students around a whiteboard, smiling as she encouraged them to explain their thinking rather than rush toward an answer. Nothing about her manner had changed. She still celebrated curiosity more than perfection. Watching her teach, Richard understood why brilliance had remained hidden from so many people for so long. It had never demanded attention. It had simply continued serving others, waiting patiently for someone willing to notice. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, it reflected softly across the polished floor much like the lights that had filled the restaurant on the evening they first met. The difference was that no one laughed before listening anymore. Children of every background sat together solving problems, asking questions, and discovering confidence one equation at a time. Richard quietly placed the original cocktail napkin inside a simple frame that hung near the classroom entrance beneath the foundation's mission statement. Visitors often paused to study the 3 handwritten lines that had changed so many lives, never realizing they had once been dismissed as nothing more than the thoughts of a waitress. Naomi smiled whenever she noticed students reading the framed napkin because she knew the lesson it carried reached far beyond mathematics. Every person has a story hidden beneath the work they do, the clothes they wear, or the assumptions others make about them. Sometimes the greatest act of wisdom is not solving the hardest equation. It is choosing to see the human being standing in front of you before deciding what they are capable of, and in that quiet classroom filled with hope, respect, and opportunity, the truest answer of all finally found its place. This is the end of our story. Thank you so much for visiting our channel and spending your time with us. We truly appreciate every view, every comment, and every moment you share with our stories. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like to support our channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to keep creating more high-quality stories for you. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next video.